It was a morning of blinding, relentless snow. A bitter January frost had gripped London, and the heavy white flakes fell so thickly that the buildings across Baker Street were reduced to mere ghostly silhouettes. The cobbled streets were muffled and silent, the usual clatter of hansom cabs completely subdued by the deepening drifts. It was the sort of weather that forced honest men to remain by their firesides, leaving the city to the elements. Within the warm confines of 221B, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was engaged in an exercise that threatened to drive me entirely mad. For the past 3 hours, he had stood by the window, plucking a single, discordant string on his violin, timing the reverberations with a silver pocket watch. "The acoustic dampening properties of heavy snow, Watson," Holmes announced, setting the watch down with a sharp click, "are truly remarkable. A gunshot fired in the street below would sound like nothing more than a snapping twig from this room. It is a smuggler's paradise out there today. Yet the criminal element of London remains tragically uninspired. They prefer the warmth of the pub to the chill of a truly great puzzle." I set aside my medical journal, thankful for stopping the noise. Perhaps even criminals have the good sense to avoid freezing to death. Holmes. "Genius does not feel the cold, my dear doctor," Holmes sighed, throwing himself onto the sofa in a dramatic display of ennui. "My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram, and I am in my proper atmosphere. But this cozy, domestic peace is suffocating." As if the universe had taken pity on his restless intellect, a heavy, frantic pounding shook our street door. The sound was muffled by the snow, but the sheer desperation behind the blows was unmistakable. Moments later, heavy boots thundered up the 17 steps, and our sitting-room door was pushed open. The man who stumbled into our room looked as though he had wrestled with a ghost. He was tall and angular, wrapped in a heavy wool overcoat completely caked in fresh snow. His face was a ghastly shade of grey, his breathing ragged and shallow. He stood in the doorway, a frozen spectre clutching a massive rusted pair of iron bolt cutters in his trembling left hand. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he rasped, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "I am he," Holmes replied, sitting up instantly, all traces of boredom vanishing from his sharp features. "And this is my associate, Dr. Watson. Pray, sir, set down those bolt cutters before you drop them on Mrs. Hudson's floorboards. Draw near the fire. You have suffered a terrible shock, Mr. Blackwood." The man froze, the heavy iron tool slipping from his grip to land with a heavy thud on the carpet. How could you possibly know my name?" Holmes offered a thin, brilliant smile, his eyes dancing with analytical delight. "It is stenciled upon the leather satchel slung across your shoulder. As to your profession, the yellow chalk dust on your right cuff, combined with the distinct calluses on the side of your index finger, marks you as an architectural surveyor. The distinct smell of old, decaying parchment, clinging to your coat, tells me you spend your days in municipal archives. And since you are currently carrying a pair of heavy bolt cutters that reek of oxidized iron and damp earth, I deduce you were recently tasked with forcing entry into a very old, very sealed property on behalf of the City Council." Mr. Horace Blackwood collapsed into the armchair I pushed toward him, staring at Holmes with a mixture of awe and terror. "You see everything. They said you were a wizard, and by God, they were right. Yes, Mr. Holmes, I am a senior surveyor for the city. I was sent this morning to oversee the demolition preparations for a property that the council recently acquired from the diocese." "Ah," Holmes said, leaning forward, his fingertips pressed together in his customary pose of deep concentration. "The chapel of St. Jude on Grimpen Lane, shut down by a sudden, highly secretive ecclesiastical order in the winter of 1846. "Exactly," Blackwood swallowed hard, warming his trembling hands near the flames. 40 years ago, Mr. Holmes. The chapel was boarded up. The heavy oak doors were wrapped in iron chains, and a massive padlock was sealed over the latch. The church refused to say why, only that the ground was no longer holy. It has sat there, rotting in the shadows of Grimpen Lane, for 4 decades. Until today, I interjected, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the snowstorm outside. The land was sold to the new railway expansion, Blackwood explained. My orders were to cut the chains, document the interior architecture for the archives, and clear it for the wrecking crews. I went alone this morning, before the snow grew too heavy. It took me half an hour of brutal labor with those cutters to snap the padlock. The iron was rusted solid. When I finally pushed the heavy doors open, he broke off, a violent shudder racking his frame. "Take your time, Mr. Blackwood," Holmes said softly, though his eyes burned with a fierce, hungry light. "The air inside was dead," Blackwood whispered, staring into the fire, stale and choked with the dust of 40 years. The stone floor was covered in an unbroken blanket of grey grime, thick as the snow falling outside. No rat track, no insect trail. Absolute, perfect isolation. "And what did you find at the altar?" Holmes pressed. Blackwood looked up, his eyes wide with an unutterable horror. "A man, Mr. Holmes, hanging from the heavy iron chandelier directly above the pews. But he was no skeleton. 40 years ago. He was freshly dead. The blood dripping from his boots onto the stone floor was still wet. I let out a gasp of astonishment. Freshly dead in a sealed chapel. "Yes, Doctor," Blackwood cried, his voice bordering on hysteria. "But that is the nightmare of it. I swear to you upon my life. The thick layer of 40-year-old dust on the floor was entirely untouched. There were no footprints leading to the body. None. The windows are stained glass, barred from the outside with solid iron and completely unbroken. The roof is solid slate. The only door was the one I just cut the chains from." Silence descended upon the sitting room, heavy and absolute. Holmes sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then, with a sudden fluid motion, he sprang to his feet. He seized his heavy Inverness cape and tossed my scarf toward my chair. "A locked room, Watson," Holmes cried, his voice ringing with pure, unadulterated joy. "Sealed for 40 years, an unbroken sea of dust, and a freshly murdered corpse suspended in the air. Oh, the criminal classes have redeemed themselves. Come, Doctor, into the snow. We have a magnificent impossibility to unravel." The journey in the four-wheeler was a treacherous crawl through the snow-choked streets of London. The heavy flakes continued to fall with blinding fury, transforming familiar thoroughfares into a freezing wasteland. Inside the carriage, the frigid air bit through our coats, but Sherlock Holmes seemed impervious to the plunging temperatures. He sat opposite Blackwood and myself, his profile illuminated by passing gas lamps, his eyes burning with terrifying intensity. He asked our companion rapid, specific questions regarding the padlock, the iron chains, and the historical records surrounding the diocese's sudden decision to seal the property 4 decades prior. Blackwood, shivering violently from his gruesome discovery, could provide little beyond the fact that the ecclesiastical decree had been swift, absolute, and accompanied by whispers of unholy desecration. We finally arrived at Grimpen Lane, a forgotten artery tucked away in the city's older districts. The lane was practically impassable, buried under drifts of pristine white snow that had not yet been marred by a single wheel or pedestrian boot. The Chapel of St. Jude stood at the very end of this desolate passage, a Gothic monolith of blackened stone that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Its arched windows were dark and sightless, the stained glass obscured by decades of accumulated grime and the iron grates that crisscrossed the exterior masonry. The massive double doors of oak, studded with oxidized iron nails, stood partially ajar, held open by the howling wind. Scattered in the freshly fallen snow at the threshold were the severed links of a rusted iron chain and the shattered remains of a formidable padlock. Holmes did not rush inside. Instead, he dropped to his knees in the freezing snow, producing his magnifying glass and studying the severed chains with microscopic intensity. He ran his bare fingers over the rough metal, oblivious to the biting frost. He then turned his attention to the oak doors, examining the hinges and the wood surrounding the lock mechanism. I stood shivering beside the surveyor, stamping my feet to ward off the numbness creeping into my toes, waiting for my friend to conclude his icy vigil. When he finally rose, his expression was an unreadable mask of intense concentration. He brushed the snow from his knees and, without a word, pushed the heavy door wider, gesturing for us to follow him into the gloom. The interior of the chapel was a sepulchre of freezing shadows and stagnant, ancient air. The only illumination came from the diffuse light spilling through the open doorway and the ghostly glow filtering through the grime, caked stained glass above. I stepped just inside the threshold and stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat at the scene before us. The surveyor had not exaggerated in the slightest. The stone floor of the nave was covered in a thick, unbroken carpet of grey, pulverized limestone and decades of undisturbed dust. It lay perfectly smooth, like the surface of a frozen pond, devoid of a single footprint, mouse track, or disturbance. And yet, suspended in the freezing air halfway down the central aisle, hanging from the heavy iron chandelier by a thick hemp rope, was the body of a man. He was dressed in a modern overcoat, his head pitched forward at a grotesque angle. In the dim light, I could just make out the dark, glistening droplets of fresh blood falling slowly from the tips of his highly polished boots, striking the thick layer of dust below with a sickening, muffled rhythm. The absolute impossibility of the tableau struck me with the force of a physical blow. A man had been murdered and hoisted into the air, yet his killer had left absolutely no trace upon the immaculate, dusty floor beneath him. Holmes stood at the threshold, his eyes sweeping the vaulted ceiling, the pillars, and the expanse of dust with the calculating precision of a surveyor. He warned both Blackwood and myself not to advance beyond the entrance mat, lest we contaminate the crime scene. Then, utilizing remarkable physical agility, Holmes hoisted himself onto the narrow, elevated stone plinth running along the perimeter of the chapel wall, designed centuries ago to hold statues. Pressing his back against the freezing masonry, he edged his way slowly down the length of the chapel, balancing precariously above the untouched floor, moving toward the hanging corpse without ever setting foot upon the dust. I watched in breathless silence as he navigated the treacherous ledge, his magnifying glass held ready. When he finally drew level with the suspended body, he leaned forward, holding onto a stone corbel for support. He examined the deceased with intense scrutiny. He noted the man's clothing, the precise knot of the hemp rope, and the pooling blood on the boots. Suddenly, Holmes froze. His body went entirely rigid, his eyes locked upon a seemingly insignificant detail near the victim's left shoulder. He leaned closer, his nose mere inches from the corpse's overcoat, and let out a soft intake of breath. He quickly withdrew tweezers from his pocket, plucked something invisible from the fabric, and deposited it into a vial. He then turned his attention to the heavy iron chandelier itself, studying the chain attached to the vaulted ceiling high above. A strange, triumphant smile flickered across his face, there and gone in an instant. He did not share his discovery. Instead, he carefully made his way back along the perimeter ledge, dropping lightly onto the entrance mat beside me. He possessed the calm demeanor of a man who had found the final piece of a complex puzzle, though, to my eyes, the mystery had only deepened into an abyss of impossibility. Holmes did not immediately descend from the ledge, but instead remained perched upon the stone plinth, his gaze fixed on the ceiling with an intensity that suggested he was peering through the very substance of the architecture. After a moment of profound silence, he stepped down onto the entrance mat, his boots clicking sharply against the stone. He did not look at the surveyor or myself, but instead walked to the open door, his eyes tracing the line from the threshold to the center of the chapel. He stood there for several minutes, the freezing wind whipping at his coat, his expression a study in calculated detachment. I watched him, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for him to illuminate the darkness that seemed to swallow this place whole. Finally, he turned, his face illuminated by a cold, sharp gleam of intellectual triumph. "Lestrade," he announced, his voice echoing in the vast tomb-like space, "will be along shortly. When he arrives, you must ensure that he does not touch the floor. Not a single inch of that dust can be disturbed until I have completed my measurements." There is a logic here, however hidden it may seem to the casual observer. The man hanging before us is not merely a victim. He is the center of a very elaborate, very lethal machine. He gestured toward the body, which continued to sway almost imperceptibly in the drafts. "Note the polish on his boots, Watson. Look at the fabric quality of his coat. This man was not a vagrant or a desperate soul seeking refuge in a derelict chapel. He was a gentleman of substance, and he was brought here with a very specific purpose in mind." I approached the edge of the mat, peering into the gloom. The victim appeared to be a man in his prime, his clothes expensive, his hands well manicured. It made no sense. Why would a man of wealth come to this forgotten, decaying relic of the past, only to meet such a brutal end? Holmes ignored my unspoken question and instead began to pace the narrow strip of stone along the wall, his eyes darting toward the floor. He stopped suddenly, crouching down as he had done at the doorway. He reached out, not touching the dust, but hovering his fingers just above it. "Look closely, Watson," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Dust is not just limestone and decay. It is layered. Look at the slight discoloration in the pattern near the victim's feet. It is as if the air itself had been displaced by a force that did not walk, but rather arrived." The surveyor, Blackwood, had remained by the entrance, his face ashen, his hands clutching his satchel. He spoke then, his voice shaking. "Mr. Holmes, I have been in this building 3 times before today to prepare for the demolition. I know every stone of this place. There is no entrance, no hatch, no cellar door, and no way for a man to reach the chandelier without traversing the floor. Even the stained glass is fixed. I examined it myself. It is impossible." Holmes turned toward him, his smile thin and devoid of warmth. "Impossible is a word that I have found to be a convenient refuge for those who do not look closely enough at the reality of their situation. Nothing is truly impossible, Mr. Blackwood. There are only events for which we have not yet discovered the mechanism of occurrence." I realized then that Holmes was not looking for an intruder, but for the remnants of a process. He was studying the chapel as one would study the intricate clockwork components of a watch. He began to dictate instructions to me, his voice rapid and precise. "Watson, I require you to record the exact dimensions of the chandelier's suspension chain. Measure the distance from the chain to the nearest pillar, and from the pillar to the wall. Do it with the absolute precision of a mathematician. As for you, Blackwood, return to your offices and bring me every blueprint and structural survey of this chapel that the council possesses. I want to see the original designs, the structural modifications made in 1846, and every document regarding the closure. Do not return until you have them in your hands." The surveyor did not need to be told twice. He turned and fled into the snow, leaving us alone in the freezing, dead air of the sanctuary. I felt a profound sense of unease. The hanging man, the untouched dust, the sheer silence of the place. It felt like a tomb not just for the victim, but for reason itself. Holmes, however, was in his element. He moved with a speed and dexterity that defied the icy conditions, his focus absolute. He climbed back onto the ledge, this time maneuvering himself to the base of the chandelier where it met the ceiling. He spent an age there, his lens pressed to the iron. When he finally descended, his eyes were blazing. "It is a masterpiece of deception, Watson," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "A trap built upon a foundation of history. They counted on the dust being our greatest enemy, a shroud that would prevent anyone from seeing the truth. They assumed that a closed chapel would be perceived as a static, unchanging thing. But history, like dust, is a layer that can be manipulated, and even the most ancient stone can be made to serve a modern atrocity." He didn't explain further, but I saw in the way he held himself that the game had shifted from a search for a phantom to a pursuit of a very human, very deliberate killer. We stood in the center of that desolate space, the victim swaying gently above us, and, for the first time, I felt not the presence of a ghost, but the cold, calculating shadow of a murderer who was likely watching us from somewhere in the freezing, white-out world outside. I checked my revolver, ensuring it was ready for whatever the storm might unleash upon us, for I knew that the truth, when it finally emerged from the shadows of this tomb, would be far more dangerous than any legend the superstitious mind could conjure. Holmes signaled to me, and we prepared to leave, the truth waiting in the blueprints that would soon reveal the hidden anatomy of this impossible murder. The biting chill of the chapel seemed to intensify as the afternoon light began to fail, casting long, skeletal shadows across the nave. I stood by the entrance, my hand resting instinctively upon the grip of my revolver, watching Holmes as he paced the narrow perimeter ledge, with the silent, predatory focus of a panther. He had not spoken for 20 minutes, his attention entirely consumed by the architectural anomalies of the space. My own thoughts were a chaotic jumble of impossibilities. The undisturbed dust, the locked doors, and the brutal reality of the dead man hanging before us. How could a murderer navigate this chamber without leaving a trace? It was as if the crime had been committed by a spirit, or by some unseen mechanism embedded within the very bones of the sanctuary. I watched as Holmes reached the junction where the ceiling met the eastern wall, stopping to examine a section of mortar that appeared significantly fresher than the surrounding stone. He did not touch it, but his lens hovered mere millimeters from the surface, his lips moving in a silent count. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the chapel was broken by the sound of muffled rhythmic thuds, echoing from the snow-covered lane outside. A moment later, the main doors groaned further open, and Inspector Lestrade appeared, his face flushed with the exertion of the trek, his coat heavily laden with snow. He stepped inside, shaking his umbrella with a flourish that sent a spray of melting slush dangerously close to the edge of the dust-covered floor. Holmes held up a sharp, warning hand, stopping the inspector in his tracks. Lestrade halted, his expression shifting from irritation to profound curiosity as he took in the bizarre scene. He looked at the hanging body, then at the expanse of untouched dust, his mouth working in a silent, bewildered line. He asked if we had found any sign of a secret passage, any hidden lever, or any evidence of a second entrance. Holmes simply shook his head, his eyes never leaving the ceiling. He stepped down from the ledge with a feline grace, landing softly on the entrance mat. He looked at the inspector with a gaze that contained a mixture of amusement and professional disdain. "The answer, Lestrade, is not in secret doors or hidden tunnels. You are looking at this chapel as if it were a tomb, when you should be viewing it as a clock. Every element here, the dust, the chandelier, the ropes, the very placement of the body serves a function. The murder was not committed when the man was hoisted into the air. It was committed before the chapel was even sealed 40 years ago, or rather, the mechanism was set in motion. Then, the inspector stared at him, his brow furrowed in a deep, confused knot. A mechanism set in motion 4 decades ago. Holmes, you are talking about a dead man. This victim is fresh. You yourself said the blood was still dripping. Holmes walked to the edge of the dust, hovering his feet just above the grime. He explained that the victim had been murdered recently, but the method employed was a relic of a past that had been meticulously preserved and repurposed. He pointed toward the chandelier, noting the subtle tension in the iron chain, which did not sag as one would expect from a weight of that magnitude. It was taut, held by a hidden counterweight system integrated into the roof trusses during the final construction phase of the building. The murder was a delayed execution, a trap triggered not by an intruder, but by the very act of opening the chapel doors. When Blackwood shattered the rusted padlock and pushed the doors open, he had unwittingly released a series of hidden pins that had held the counterweight in equilibrium for 40 years. The weight had dropped, the rope had tightened, and the man, who had likely been drugged and positioned beneath the chandelier by someone with access to the keys, was hoisted into the air with silent, mechanical precision. Lestrade's face went white. He asked, who could possibly possess the knowledge to construct such a monstrous device, and who would have the keys to the chapels? Holmes gestured toward the altar, where a small brass-bound register sat on a pedestal covered in a thick layer of grey grime. He told the inspector that the register contained the names of every person who had possessed a master key to the church since the diocese's decree. He had already scanned the ledger from the entrance, and one name appeared repeatedly in the recent maintenance logs for the railway demolition team. The killer was not a phantom, but the very man who had spearheaded the railway project and stood to gain the most from the chapel's destruction. By ensuring the chapel was demolished, he had hoped to bury the evidence of his mechanical murder forever, turning a historical relic into the final resting place for a secret he had been nursing for a lifetime. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The killer had used the chapel's own history as a weapon, transforming a place of worship into an instrument of cold-blooded vengeance. Holmes explained that the victim was the grandson of the original bishop who had ordered the chapel's closure in 1846, and he had been lured here under the pretense of recovering family heirlooms. He was a pawn in a blood game that had been played for generations. The inspector, finally beginning to grasp the chilling reality of the situation, demanded the killer's name. Holmes remained silent for a heartbeat, watching the falling snow. He told Lestrade that the killer was none other than the grandson of the former church caretaker, a man whose family had been cast out in disgrace 40 years ago following the original scandals. He was a man who had waited for decades for this specific moment, when the chapel would be opened, to strike his final blow. As Lestrade barked orders to his men outside, calling for the arrest of the railway director, Holmes turned to me, his eyes filled with a weary intellectual melancholy. He remarked that it was the ultimate tragedy of such cases to see how easily a man could be consumed by a grievance that existed long before his birth. He had turned his life into a slow, burning fuse, culminating in a death that had been planned while he was still a child. I watched the inspector and his constables prepare to depart, feeling the immense weight of the chapel's history pressing down upon us. The case was solved, the mechanical horror unmasked, but the shadow of what had occurred here would remain, buried in the dust and the stone, a testament to the fact that some doors, once closed, should perhaps remain locked for eternity. Holmes stepped out into the biting cold of the evening, his figure silhouetted against the blinding white, his mind already moving toward the next mystery, leaving the silence of St. Jude's behind us. The arrest of the railway director, a man named Silas Vane, was conducted with a swift, brutal efficiency that contrasted sharply with the ghostly stillness of the chapel. We stood in the freezing slush of Grimpen Lane as Lestrade's constables led the man away, his face contorted in a mask of impotent, snarling rage. He did not deny the accusation. Instead, he laughed. A jagged, hysterical sound that seemed to mock the very air of the winter evening. He confessed that his grandfather had been the primary victim of the original 1846 scandal, a man whose reputation had been systematically dismantled by the bishop's ancestors to protect the church's standing. Vane had spent his entire adult life documenting every detail of that ancient betrayal, waiting for the precise moment when the chapel would be opened for demolition, turning the building itself into the instrument of his vengeance. He had drugged his victim, a man whose only crime was his lineage, and positioned him beneath the mechanism with the calm, methodical patience of a man constructing a clock. As they forced him into the back of the waiting police wagon, he shouted that the debt had finally been settled, that the blood of the past had at last been washed clean by the violence of the present. I watched the wagon disappear into the swirling white curtain of the storm, feeling a profound, lingering sense of unease. The mechanical precision of his plan had been terrifying, but the raw, unadulterated hatred that fueled it was far worse. It was a malignancy that had been allowed to fester for decades, hidden behind the mundane mask of a railway director, waiting for the opportunity to manifest in such a hideous public act of retribution. Holmes, meanwhile, remained by the chapel entrance, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky, as if searching for a pattern in the chaos of the falling snow. He seemed entirely unmoved by the dramatic conclusion of the arrest, his mind already drifting toward the abstract implications of the crime. When I approached him, he turned, his expression pensive. He remarked that Vane was a man of remarkable, if perverted, intellectual discipline. To design a mechanical death trap that would remain functional for 40 years, impervious to rust and the creeping rot of time, required an engineering acumen that he had wasted entirely upon the altar of his own ancestral grievance. Had he applied that same meticulous focus to the railway or to the sciences, he could have been a man of great consequence. But instead, he chose to become the architect of a forgotten ghost story. He looked back at the gaping, dark maw of the chapel, the interior now a frozen tomb of dust and iron, and remarked that there was a certain grim irony in the fact that the very building Vane sought to destroy had, in its final hour, become his prison. The law would deal with him, but the true punishment was the life he had sacrificed on the altar of a bitterness he had inherited from a man long dead. We walked back toward the main thoroughfare, the crunch of our boots in the deep snow, the only sound in the suffocating silence of the lane. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet, his steps measured and slow. I asked him if he felt any satisfaction in having unmasked such a cunning, calculated killer. He sighed, a faint cloud of vapor rising into the freezing air. He told me that satisfaction is an emotion reserved for those who believe that justice is a clean, definitive thing. For him, the case was merely a reminder of the fragility of the human spirit when it is anchored to the past. He had solved the impossible, yes, but the cost had been the life of an innocent man and the complete destruction of a mind that had been warped by a century-old wrong. There were no victors in such a conflict, only those who had survived the collision of history and hatred. I looked at him, admiring the calm, unwavering brilliance that allowed him to see the world as a grand, interconnected puzzle, and realized that for all his cold exterior, he felt the weight of these tragedies more keenly than he would ever admit. As we reached the corner of the lane, a handsome cab pulled up to the curb, its driver wrapped in layers of wool, his breath forming a dense mist against the lantern light. Holmes signaled the man, and we climbed into the warmth of the cabins. The interior was dry and smelled of leather and coal, smoke, a welcome contrast to the bitter, biting gale outside. As the cab lurched forward, rocking gently on its springs, Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes, the weariness of the day finally beginning to show in the slight tension of his jaw. He told me that for all the complexities of the mechanical trap, the most dangerous element of the entire case had been the silence of the building itself. Had the chapel not been perceived as a place of stagnant history, had it not been treated as a static relic, the truth would have been apparent from the beginning. We make ourselves vulnerable to such monstrosities whenever we treat the past as something fixed, rather than something that can be reanimated. He remained silent for the rest of the journey, his thoughts once again adrift in the vast, logical expanse of his own mind, leaving me to contemplate the strange, terrible beauty of the mystery we had just brought to a close. We arrived back at Baker Street to find the fire still burning bright, the warmth of the room a testament to the quiet, predictable safety of our own lives. It was the end of a long, chilling ordeal, a case that had begun with a ghost and ended with the ugly, undeniable reality of a human heart poisoned by the echoes of a distant, unforgiving yesterday. The arrest of the railway director, a man named Silas Vane, was conducted with a swift, brutal efficiency that contrasted sharply with the ghostly stillness of the chapel. We stood in the freezing slush of Grimpen Lane as Lestrade's constables led the man away, his face contorted in a mask of impotent, snarling rage. He did not deny the accusation. Instead, he laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound that seemed to mock the very air of the winter evening. He confessed that his grandfather had been the primary victim of the original 1846 scandal, a man whose reputation had been systematically dismantled by the bishop's ancestors to protect the church's standing. Vane had spent his entire adult life documenting every detail of that ancient betrayal, waiting for the precise moment when the chapel would be opened for demolition, turning the building itself into the instrument of his vengeance. He had drugged his victim, a man whose only crime was his lineage, and positioned him beneath the mechanism with the calm, methodical patience of a man constructing a clock. As they forced him into the back of the waiting police wagon, he shouted that the debt had finally been settled, that the blood of the past had at last been washed clean by the violence of the present. I watched the wagon disappear into the swirling white curtain of the storm, feeling a profound, lingering sense of unease. The mechanical precision of his plan had been terrifying, but the raw, unadulterated hatred that fueled it was far worse. It was a malignancy that had been allowed to fester for decades, hidden behind the mundane mask of a railway director, waiting for the opportunity to manifest in such a hideous, public act of retribution. Holmes, meanwhile, remained by the chapel entrance, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky, as if searching for a pattern in the chaos of the falling snow. He seemed entirely unmoved by the dramatic conclusion of the arrest, his mind already drifting toward the abstract implications of the crime. When I approached him, he turned, his expression pensive. He remarked that Vane was a man of remarkable, if perverted, intellectual discipline. To design a mechanical death trap that would remain functional for 40 years, impervious to rust and the creeping rot of time, required an engineering acumen that he had wasted entirely upon the altar of his own ancestral grievance. Had he applied that same meticulous focus to the railway or to the sciences, he could have been a man of great consequence. But instead, he chose to become the architect of a forgotten ghost story. He looked back at the gaping dark maw of the chapel, the interior now a frozen tomb of dust and iron, and remarked that there was a certain grim irony in the fact that the very building Vane sought to destroy had, in its final hour, become his prison. The law would deal with him, but the true punishment was the life he had sacrificed on the altar of a bitterness he had inherited from a man long dead. We walked back toward the main thoroughfare, the crunch of our boots in the deep snow, the only sound in the suffocating silence of the lane. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet, his steps measured and slow. I asked him if he felt any satisfaction in having unmasked such a cunning, calculated killer. He sighed, a faint cloud of vapor rising into the freezing air. He told me that satisfaction is an emotion reserved for those who believe that justice is a clean, definitive thing. For him, the case was merely a reminder of the fragility of the human spirit when it is anchored to the past. He had solved the impossible, yes, but the cost had been the life of an innocent man and the complete destruction of a mind that had been warped by a century-old wrong. There were no victors in such a conflict, only those who had survived the collision of history and hatred. I looked at him, admiring the calm, unwavering brilliance that allowed him to see the world as a grand interconnected puzzle, and realized that for all his cold exterior, he felt the weight of these tragedies more keenly than he would ever admit. As we reached the corner of the lane, a handsome cab pulled up to the curb, its driver wrapped in layers of wool, his breath forming a dense mist against the lantern light. Holmes signaled the man, and we climbed into the warmth of the cabin. The interior was dry and smelled of leather and coal smoke, a welcome contrast to the bitter biting gale outside. As the cab lurched forward, rocking gently on its springs, Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes, the weariness of the day finally beginning to show in the slight tension of his jaw. He told me that for all the complexities of the mechanical trap, the most dangerous element of the entire case had been the silence of the building itself. Had the chapel not been perceived as a place of stagnant history, had it not been treated as a static relic, the truth would have been apparent from the beginning. We make ourselves vulnerable to such monstrosities whenever we treat the past as something fixed, rather than something that can be reanimated. He remained silent for the rest of the journey, his thoughts once again adrift in the vast logical expanse of his own mind, leaving me to contemplate the strange, terrible beauty of the mystery we had just brought to a close. We arrived back at Baker Street to find the fire still burning bright, the warmth of the room a testament to the quiet, predictable safety of our own lives. It was the end of a long, chilling ordeal, a case that had begun with a legend and ended with the ugly, undeniable reality of a human heart poisoned by the echoes of a distant, unforgiving yesterday. Before I retired, I could not help but ponder the nature of Holmes himself. He is a man who peels back the layers of reality to expose the clockwork beneath. Yet even he cannot always silence the echoes of the human misery he uncovers. As the embers died, I realized that tonight our mystery was not merely the death trap, but the persistence of sorrow. Good night, Baker Street Enigma listeners. Stay vigilant and remember that even in the deepest winter, the truth has a way of thawing the frozen ground. With the resolution of the Grimpen Lane mystery and the subsequent incarceration of Silas Vane, a welcome, if brief, reprieve settled upon 221B Baker Street. The relentless snow that had defined our recent ordeal finally surrendered to a thawing, grey drizzle, and the city of London began to shake off the lethargy of the deep winter. I found myself returning to the rhythms of my medical practice with a renewed sense of purpose, while Holmes retreated into a period of profound, analytical isolation. He spent his days and nights buried within the sprawling, chaotic expanse of his own index files, referencing ancient ecclesiastical records with the mechanical blueprints he had recovered from the council's archives. It was a peculiar, almost obsessive labor, yet I knew my friend well enough to understand that for Holmes, the conclusion of a case was never truly an end. It was merely a data point to be catalogued in the grand, unending ledger of human fallibility. He seemed haunted by the mechanical precision of Vane's trap, his mind constantly circling back to the intersection of ancient bitterness and modern ingenuity. I would often find him sitting by the fire, his violin silent, staring into the flickering embers with a look of intense internal debate, as if he were re-evaluating the very nature of justice itself. It was during one such quiet evening, while the gaslight hissed softly in the brackets, that a fresh, unexpected complication arrived at our doors. The nature of this new development was not a murder nor a disappearance, but a curious intellectual provocation that arrived in the form of a heavily sealed parchment delivered by a frantic mud-spattered courier who had travelled all the way from the remote reaches of the Yorkshire moors. Holmes opened the packet with a surgeon's delicacy, his eyes scanning the elegant, flowing script with a growing sense of anticipation. It was a letter from a renowned academic, a scholar of historical jurisprudence, who had become obsessed with a series of anomalies within the local land deeds of a village bordering the moors. The scholar claimed to have discovered a hidden coded sequence embedded within the ancient legal descriptions of the parish boundaries, a sequence that he believed pointed to a massive, long-concealed act of structural fraud that had effectively erased an entire village from the historical record. Holmes did not utter a word as he read, but the subtle, sharp arch of his eyebrow was sufficient to inform me that his period of enforced stagnation had officially come to an end. He tossed the letter onto the dining table and looked at me, a wolfish, vibrant light rekindling in his gaze. The letter, he noted with a dry, precise tone, was a classic example of an intellectual siren song. It contained a perfect multifaceted mystery, an act of legal deception, a missing population, and a structural anomaly that had remained undetected for over a century. He explained that the geography of the Yorkshire moors was a labyrinth of ancient, shifting boundaries, and the idea that a village could be surgically removed from the legal consciousness of the state was a feat of bureaucratic brilliance that he found utterly irresistible. He had been concerned that the case of the chapel was an isolated instance of ancestral vengeance, but this new challenge suggested a much larger, more systematic subversion of the law. He began to pace the narrow confines of our sitting room, his movements no longer lethargic but charged with the kinetic, restless energy of a man who has finally identified a target worthy of his full, undivided attention. He made no secret of his excitement. He welcomed the prospect of an investigation that would require not just his deductive faculties, but an intimate, exhaustive knowledge of the labyrinthine complexities of 19th-century property law. I must confess that I felt a profound sense of trepidation at the prospect of yet another trek into the bleak, unforgiving landscape of the north, especially while the winter thaw was still turning the moors into a treacherous, impassable bog. I pointed out to him that we had only just returned from a case that had pushed our physical and mental endurance to the breaking point, and that a period of domestic tranquility would surely be the wiser course of action. Holmes brushed my protest aside with a single, dismissive gesture of his hand. He argued that tranquility is a luxury for those who do not understand the precarious nature of the truth. If a village could be erased, if a history could be rewritten by a clever enough hand, then the very foundations upon which society relied were far more porous than anyone dared to admit. We were not just dealing with land deeds, he insisted. We were dealing with the potential for a catastrophic erosion of historical record. It was a problem of scale, of time, and of the fundamental, systemic exploitation of the law. He spent the remainder of the night preparing for our departure, his enthusiasm a sharp, infectious contrast to the gloom of the storm that was beginning to rattle our windows once again. He packed his kit with an obsessive attention to detail, ensuring he had the necessary magnifying lenses, the archival tracing papers, and the small, specialized tools he would need to navigate the complexities of the moorland archives. I watched him, realizing that for all my reservations, I was already resigned to the inevitability of the adventure. There was no argument that could deflect Holmes from a trail that piqued his intellectual curiosity, and in truth, I had no desire to be left behind while he unraveled the secrets of the moors. He stopped at the door, his Inverness cape wrapped securely about his shoulders, and looked at me with a rare, candid expression of genuine gratitude. He thanked me for my steadfast companionship, acknowledging that even the most formidable intellect requires a grounding influence to navigate the messier aspects of human tragedy. It was a moment of profound, understated connection that served to reinforce the silent, unbreakable pact between us. We stepped out into the night, the air biting and cold, the city lights shimmering like distant, fallen stars against the black, encroaching gloom. The carriage waited for us, its lanterns casting long, distorted shadows across the wet cobblestones. As we settled into the interior, Holmes leaned back, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, his mind already miles away on the barren, wind-swept ridges of the north. He remarked that every great investigation is essentially a process of translation, of turning the incoherent, chaotic language of the world into the clear, elegant grammar of the truth. He looked forward to the Yorkshire archive, not as a chore, but as a long-awaited conversation with the ghosts of the past. As we pulled away from Baker Street, leaving the familiar warmth of our hearth behind, I realized that we were not merely chasing a historical anomaly. We were stepping into a mystery that would likely require us to challenge the very legitimacy of the past itself. The cold, crisp promise of the Yorkshire moors lay ahead, and with it, the certainty that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually be forced to reveal its hidden, unvarnished face. The journey to the Yorkshire moors was a grueling odyssey of rattling rail carriages and bone, shaking local coaches that seemed to navigate the desolate, fog-choked landscape by instinct alone. As we ventured further north, the familiar, suffocating yellow gloom of London gave way to the stark, unforgiving expanse of the moorland, a place where the earth itself seemed to mourn the passage of time. The sky remained a heavy, oppressive shroud of slate grey, and the wind, untempered by the buildings of the city, cut through our heavy woolens with the sharp indifference of a razor. Holmes remained in a state of high, suppressed excitement, his attention entirely consumed by the sheaf of legal documents he had procured from the village archives before we even set foot upon the actual land. He spoke little, his fingers constantly tracing the faded ink of the land deeds, his eyes darting back and forth across the parchment as if searching for a hidden geometry in the language of the surveyors. He noted to me that the village of Oakhaven, which supposedly vanished from all maps and tax rolls in the late 18th century, was not merely a casualty of poor record-keeping, but a victim of a sophisticated predatory legal maneuver. He compared the deeds of the surrounding parishes to the original grant, noting that the parish boundaries had been subtly, expertly redrawn to absorb the land of Oakhaven into the neighbouring holdings. It was a cartographic sleight of hand that had been executed over the course of a generation, a quiet, bloodless theft that had effectively erased a thriving community from existence without a single protest. When we finally arrived at the village that stood closest to the heart of the anomaly, a cluster of grey stone cottages huddled against the lee of a rocky tor, the atmosphere was thick with a palpable, unspoken apprehension. The local residents, hardy, wind-bitten folk, reacted to our inquiries with a guarded, suspicious silence, their eyes darting away whenever the name Oakhaven was mentioned. It was evident that the disappearance of the village was not merely a historical curiosity, but a persistent, festering wound upon the collective memory of the region. Holmes, ever the master of the art of quiet solicitation, spent the first day not in the archives, but in the local tavern, nursing a glass of warm ale and engaging the villagers in the sort of rambling, aimless conversation that effectively lowered their defenses. He possessed the unique, innate ability to appear both entirely harmless and profoundly interested in the most mundane aspects of local folklore, and by the time the evening shadows had lengthened across the moors, he had managed to elicit a series of chilling, fragmented testimonies. They spoke of the Oakhaven families as if they were legends, people who had simply woken up one morning to find their property rights challenged, their titles invalidated, and their legal standing systematically dismantled by a series of high-handed court orders that they had lacked the literacy and the resources to effectively contest. It was a story of institutionalized malice, a slow, methodical erasure performed with the cold, unyielding precision of the law. I found the villagers' accounts to be deeply unsettling, particularly the way they described the final days of the Oakhaven parish. One elderly shepherd, his hands gnarled and stained by a lifetime of labour, told us of a winter not unlike this one, when the final families were forcibly evicted from their homes by a detachment of constables, their dwellings burned to the ground to ensure they could never return. The official records had stated that the village was abandoned due to an outbreak of an unspecified disease, but the local law told a completely different, far more human story of greed, coercion, and the crushing weight of legal injustice. Holmes listened with the intense, unblinking focus I had come to recognize as the hallmark of his deepest, most concentrated inquiries. He noted the details of the families, the dates of the eviction, and the names of the local magistrates who had authorized the land seizures, his index finger tapping a rapid rhythmic tattoo upon the table. He whispered to me that we were not merely investigating an act of fraud, we were witnessing the aftermath of an organized, premeditated campaign of systemic dispossession. The legal records were the instrument of the crime, but the impetus was a simple, base hunger for the vast, untapped mineral wealth that had recently been discovered beneath the Oakhaven valleys. That evening, as the gale intensified outside, rattling the shutters of our small boarding house like a desperate, insistent intruder, Holmes laid the deeds out upon our meager bedside table, his face a study in grim, analytical satisfaction. He had finally deciphered the hidden code, a series of deliberate, coded misspellings in the legal descriptions that pointed toward a secret, supplemental deed that had never been officially registered in the public archives. This missing document, he surmised, was the definitive proof that the entire eviction process had been a fraudulent, extra-legal enterprise from the very beginning. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, unwavering light, and told me that the person who had orchestrated the disappearance of Oakhaven had been none other than the great-grandfather of the local land baron, who now held the deeds to the entire valley. The entire mystery had been a long-buried dynastic secret, a crime that had been laundered through the generations until it had become accepted, unquestioned history. I felt a profound chill run through me, the realization that we were standing on the precipice of a revelation that would not only rewrite the local history, but potentially strip a man of his entire fortune and reputation. It was a classic Holmesian puzzle, elevated to the scale of historical justice, and as I watched him prepare his final, devastating argument, I realized that the true danger would not come from the Moors, but from the men who would do anything to keep their ancestors' sins safely beneath the earth. He extinguished the lamp, the room falling into a deep, heavy gloom, and as the storm outside groaned with a renewed, ferocious energy, I knew that the morning would bring us face to face with a truth that had been waiting for over a century to finally be unmasked, regardless of the cost. The following morning, the Yorkshire moors were bathed in an eerie pale light as the storm finally broke, leaving the landscape draped in a suffocating shroud of frozen mist. We made our way to the imposing estate of Lord Halloway, the current owner of the valley and the direct descendant of the magistrate who had signed the Oakhaven eviction orders. The house was a sprawling, melancholic edifice of grey stone that seemed to lean into the hillside, as if trying to hide from the very land it occupied. Upon our arrival, servants did not meet us, but by Holloway himself, a man whose presence was as cold and austere as the architecture surrounding him. He greeted us with a thinly veiled hostility, his narrow eyes tracking Holmes with the wary calculation of a creature accustomed to defending its territory. We were shown into a cavernous study, a room lined from floor to ceiling with the leather-bound volumes of a family history that was, according to Holmes's investigation, built upon a foundation of profound, systemic betrayal. Holmes did not waste time with the idle pleasantries of a guest. He positioned himself by the massive carved mahogany desk and laid the meticulously organized sheaves of legal records out before him, his movements deliberate, quiet, and possessed of a devastating final gravity. The conversation that ensued was not a negotiation, but a surgical dissection of Halloway's ancestral legacy. Holmes began by outlining the trajectory of the Oakhaven land grants, his voice a steady, rhythmic pulse that filled the silent study. He did not accuse Halloway of a crime committed in the present, but rather he methodically laid out the historical record of the 1846 fraud, connecting the specific coded land deeds to the illegal sequestration of the valley's mineral wealth. Holloway listened in stony silence, his fingers drumming a slow, agitated rhythm against the arm of his chair, though he could not mask the sudden, sharp tremor that shook his hand when Holmes produced the copy of the missing supplemental deed. It was the definitive instrument of the fraud, the document that confirmed the entire eviction process had been a pre-orchestrated, extra-legal enterprise aimed at personal enrichment. Holmes explained that he had retrieved this document not from the local archives, but from a hidden, mislabeled cache within the estate's own private library, a discovery he had made during the early hours of the morning when he had slipped away to examine the Holloway genealogy in person. As the narrative of his family's depravity unfurled, Holloway's composure began to fray. He insisted that the records were interpreted incorrectly, that the history of Oakhaven was a product of a more turbulent, less scrupulous era, and that he held the deeds in good faith, entirely ignorant of the ancestral sins that had secured them. His protests were hollow, the desperate flailing of a man who suddenly realized that the foundation of his entire existence had been exposed as a grand, systemic falsehood. Holmes did not challenge his denial, but instead leaned forward, his voice a razor-edged whisper. He noted that the law, while often slow, possessed a relentless, iterative memory that eventually compelled the truth to surface. The Oakhaven villagers, though long dead, were represented by the physical, undeniable evidence of the land's original ownership, and that evidence was now in the possession of the Crown. He explained that he had already dispatched a courier to the regional authorities, and that the process of restitution for the descendants of the evicted families had already been initiated. The estate, he informed Holloway, was no longer a matter of private inheritance, but a legal subject of significant public interest. Holloway's face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. He realized that the game was over, that his reputation, his fortune, and the very identity he had constructed were irrevocably fractured. He tried to dismiss us, his voice rising in an attempt to project a power he no longer possessed, but Holmes merely turned toward the door, his mission accomplished. He remarked that it was the particular tragedy of inheritance that we often receive the wealth of our predecessors without ever considering the price at which it was purchased. The truth of Oakhaven, he observed, was not that it had been forgotten, but that it had been intentionally buried beneath layers of legal artifice and dynastic pride. He left Holloway standing in the middle of his opulent tomb-like study, a man suddenly confronted with the crushing, irredeemable weight of his own history. We walked out of the manor and back into the biting, cleansing air of the moor, the truth finally exposed in the light of the morning. I felt an immense, overwhelming sense of relief that the long, dark shadow cast by the tragedy of Oakhaven had finally been dispelled, even if it meant the collapse of a dynasty. As we reached the carriage, the sun finally broke through the heavy grey clouds, casting a momentary brilliant light across the bleak ridge of the Tor. Holmes looked back at the house one last time, his eyes reflective and distant. He remarked to me that justice, in such cases, is rarely a matter of retribution, but rather a matter of clarity. We had not brought the Oakhaven villagers back, nor could we truly undo the damage of the past, but we had at least provided the record with the dignity of the truth. He spoke with the quiet, contemplative authority of a man who had seen the cycles of human greed and folly repeat themselves throughout the centuries, and who remained committed to the act of unraveling the knots, however complex they might be. As the driver cracked the whip and the carriage rattled forward, I realized that we were leaving behind not just a legal mystery, but the somber, enduring reminder that every silence has an expiration date. The truth had finally been returned to the land, and as we rattled along the winding, desolate moorland path, I knew that the story of Oakhaven would no longer be a ghost story, but a testament to the fact that nothing, no matter how deeply or cleverly hidden, can truly remain lost forever in the face of a sustained, relentless pursuit of the facts. We moved steadily toward the south, toward the comforts of London, leaving the hollow, exposed secrets of the north in our wake, ready to return to the quiet, analytical sanctuary of our Baker Street hearth. The return journey to London was marked by a profound, contemplative stillness that seemed to mirror the thaw currently transforming the moorland. The train rattled through the heart of the English countryside, the iron wheels singing a rhythmic, monotonous tune that served as the perfect cadence for Holmes's internal deliberations. He spent the better part of the trip staring out of the rain-streaked glass, his long, slender fingers tapping a silent, steady beat against the armrest of his velvet seat. Occasionally, he would produce his notebook, jotting down a brief, cryptic annotation regarding the genealogical records of the Holloway estate or the specific legal precedents that had facilitated the original Oakhaven fraud. There was no triumph in his demeanor, no trace of the predatory glee that had accompanied the unraveling of the Grimpen Lane death trap. Instead, there was only the quiet, sober gravity of a man who had confronted the enduring persistence of ancestral guilt. I occupied myself with the morning newspapers, which were already beginning to churn out the sensationalized initial accounts of the Holloway collapse, yet I found myself repeatedly glancing at my friend. It was clear that the case had left a deeper impression upon his psyche than he would ever willingly disclose, a lingering reminder of the precarious, often illusory nature of historical record, and the ease with which a single calculated lie could distort the collective memory of an entire region. Upon our arrival at the terminus, the City of London greeted us with its customary discordant symphony of shouting newsboys, clattering hansom cabs, and the thick, familiar scent of coal smoke. We made the final leg of our journey back to Baker Street in near total silence, the vibrant, chaotic energy of the capital feeling strangely distant after the stark, unforgiving desolation of the north. When we finally stepped into the warm, dimly lit sanctuary of our sitting room, the familiar sights and sounds of our lodgings provided an immediate, overwhelming sense of relief. Mrs. Hudson had ensured the fire was burning bright in anticipation of our return, the flames casting long, flickering shadows against the well-worn leather bindings of the library shelves. Holmes went straight to his study, peeling away his damp coat and boots with the weary, practiced movements of a man who had travelled a very great distance. He did not seek the immediate comfort of his chair, but instead stood for a long moment by the window, watching the distant, shimmering gaslights of the city as they fought back against the deepening evening mist. I watched him, realizing that for all the thousands of miles we had traversed, he remained, in essence, a solitary observer, a man who lived at the intersection of truth and tragedy, constantly measuring the distance between what was remembered and what had truly occurred. He turned toward me, his face softened by the glow of the firelight, and offered a faint, weary smile that spoke volumes of our shared endurance. He told me that the Holloway estate would be tied up in the courts for years to come, and that the long-overdue restitution for the Oakhaven descendants would be a grueling administrative nightmare. But the fundamental historical truth had been reclaimed. It was, he argued, a small victory, yet in a world where history was so often a curated, self-serving narrative, the act of re-establishing a suppressed fact was a significant, if quiet, achievement. He spoke of the villagers not as victims of a distant injustice, but as participants in a cycle of resilience that had somehow persisted through the decades, waiting for someone to finally read the landscape with the care and attention it deserved. It was the ultimate necessary service of the consulting detective to stand as an impartial witness to the truth, irrespective of the power, the prestige, or the elaborate artifice deployed to obscure it. I poured 2 glasses of brandy, the liquid gold capturing the firelight, and handed one to him. We toasted not to the closure of the case, but to the simple, fragile, and absolutely vital existence of the truth itself. The night deepened, the house sinking into its familiar nocturnal rhythm. Holmes eventually took his place by the hearth, the violin resting against his shoulder, though he did not play. He spent the hours in a state of deep, reflective quiet, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. I realized that our work here was finished, yet the echo of the moors would likely persist, a somber reminder of the hidden currents that shaped the world beneath the surface of the mundane. We had seen how the echoes of a 19th-century greed had reached out through the generations to silence the living, and how a meticulous, logical inquiry had finally severed the connection. It was the quintessential mystery of our vocation, the realization that the past is never truly dead, but merely waiting for someone to ask the right, inconvenient questions. As I made my way toward my own quarters, I looked back to see Holmes once more lost in the deep, analytical archives of his own mind, a solitary, sharp-eyed sentinel at the heart of an ever-changing city. The case of the Oakhaven village was closed, the ledger balanced, yet I knew that tomorrow would undoubtedly bring another knock at the door, another impossible anomaly, and another desperate plea for the singular genius that had become our life's defining, inevitable purpose. Good night to our listeners, and as the embers finally fade to ash, remember that the most enduring truths are often the ones we have been most carefully conditioned to ignore. Stay curious, stay diligent, and always look beneath the surface. The transition back to the rhythm of Baker Street was, as always, a gradual descent from the intellectual heights of our recent excursion to the comfortable, if occasionally monotonous, reality of our daily existence. The frost that had blanketed the moors had been replaced in London by a relentless soul, dampening drizzle that turned the city's thoroughfares into a slick, obsidian maze. For several days, Holmes remained in a state of deliberate, meditative withdrawal. He spent his time engaged in a curious, intensive study of the physiological effects of prolonged exposure to high-altitude environments on the human circulatory system, a topic that seemed utterly detached from the realities of our recent investigation. I observed him from the comfort of my armchair, watching as he meticulously charted blood pressure variations against atmospheric pressure readings he had gathered during our journey. It was a classic demonstration of his singular, compartmentalized focus. Once a case had been resolved, he possessed the remarkable, almost chilling ability to shed the emotional and intellectual weight of the inquiry as if it were a worn-out garment, instantly recalibrating his attention toward an entirely unrelated field of scientific or criminal investigation. I found myself envious of this, for the spectre of the Oakhaven village and the cold, mechanical cruelty of Silas Vane still lingered in the periphery of my own thoughts, a somber reminder of the dark, intricate knots of human nature he so effortlessly unraveled. It was during this period of quiet scientific incubation that a letter arrived at our door, not delivered by a desperate courier, but by the steady, measured hand of a private secretary representing one of the most powerful families in the British Parliament. The missive was a discreet, high-stakes request for consultation regarding a complex matter of maritime law and international shipping regulations that had suddenly become the subject of a volatile, secret parliamentary inquiry. The family in question, the Ashburtons, were a formidable dynasty whose fortunes were as vast as they were labyrinthine, and they were clearly anxious to resolve a lingering, potentially disastrous discrepancy in their colonial freight manifests before it could be leaked to the opposition. Holmes read the letter with a detached, professional interest, his eyes scanning the dense, bureaucratic jargon with the practiced ease of a man who had long ago mastered the inner workings of the state. He looked up at me, a faint, wry smile touching his lips, as he remarked that it was the ultimate, inevitable paradox of his vocation. The same authorities who dismissed his methods as eccentric or dangerous were consistently the first to solicit his singular expertise whenever their own, more conventional mechanisms proved inadequate to the task of maintaining the stability of their precarious, high-stakes games. I watched as he carefully set the letter aside, his mind clearly already engaged in the intricate, multi-layered architecture of the problem. He noted that the Ashburton dispute was not merely a matter of missing cargo or misfiled manifests, but a delicate, precarious issue of sovereign influence and the potential for a catastrophic diplomatic incident. It required an investigation that would necessitate not just the examination of dry archival records, but a deep, insightful understanding of the subtle shifting tides of international commerce and the private, often ruthless ambitions of those who navigated them. Holmes did not express excitement at the prospect, Rather, he viewed it with the quiet, resigned anticipation of a master strategist, preparing for a complex, multi-move contest. He gathered his coat and hat, the familiar, sharp clarity returning to his features as he prepared to step out into the evening mist to meet with the Ashburton representative at their private London residence. It was a stark contrast to the desolate, windswept ridges of the Yorkshire moors, yet it carried the same, underlying potential for the revelation of a deeply buried systemic deception. He turned to me at the door, his gaze steady and sharp, and asked if I felt up to the task of navigating the treacherous mahogany-lined corridors of the political establishment. I did not hesitate. I gathered my own belongings, ready to accompany him into the next unfolding layer of the urban labyrinth. We descended the stairs into the damp, chilling air of the street, the flickering gaslights casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. The city seemed alive with the constant, muffled motion of those pursuing their own private interests. The vast, churning mechanism of London, operating with an indifference that was both comforting and profoundly isolating. As our carriage rolled through the fog-wreathed streets, Holmes spoke in hushed, measured tones, detailing the specific hidden pressures that were currently threatening the Ashburton dynasty. He explained that the discrepancy in the shipping manifests was not a clerical error, but a calculated, deliberate attempt to circumvent international embargoes, an act of subversion that could, if properly handled, topple a ministry. It was a case that would require the absolute discretion of a phantom and the surgical precision of an expert. I realized that our work at O'Haven had been a necessary prologue, a training in the art of peeling back the layers of a carefully maintained, historical lie. Now we were to engage in the far more dangerous immediate work of navigating the current, living deceit of those who stood at the very apex of political power. As the carriage finally pulled to a stop before the iron-wrought gates of the Ashburton mansion, I felt the familiar bracing anticipation of an investigation that would test the very limits of our combined resources. The house loomed before us, a sprawling, opulent testament to the concentration of wealth and influence, its windows glowing with a warm, deceptive light that seemed to hold the secrets of the empire within its walls. Holmes stepped out into the night, his head held high, his presence suddenly transformed by the cold, commanding intellect he reserved for the most formidable of his adversaries. He looked at me, a brief, silent confirmation of our purpose, before turning to face the threshold of our next inevitable confrontation with the truth. The case of the O'Haven village had left us with a deeper understanding of the fragility of the past, but tonight we were tasked with the far more volatile, immediate duty of determining the integrity of the future. The fog swirled around us, the city breathing its cold, indifferent breath, and as we moved toward the entrance of the mansion, I knew that whatever intricate web of deception we were about to enter, it would be met by the singular, unyielding focus that defined our lives. Good night, Baker Street Enigma listeners. The city is vast, the shadows are long, and the truth is always waiting for someone with the courage to walk through the door. The investigation into the Ashburton shipping discrepancy proved to be a far more perilous undertaking than even Holmes had initially anticipated. It was not merely a matter of falsified manifests or circumvented trade embargoes. We found ourselves entangled in a sprawling, multi-continental web of corporate espionage and political blackmail that stretched from the docks of the Thames to the highest corridors of Whitehall. For 3 weeks, we operated in the shadows, navigating a landscape of hushed conferences, encrypted telegrams, and the constant chilling awareness that agents who worked for the very ministry we were investigating were shadowing us. Holmes displayed a cold, masterful efficiency throughout. His ability to synthesize disparate pieces of bureaucratic information into a cohesive narrative of corruption, nothing short of breathtaking. He utilized the same analytical rigor that had dismantled the O'Haven conspiracy. Though the stakes here were vastly magnified, we were no longer excavating the dead sins of a distant past. We were confronting the living, breathing rot of the present, and the potential for a catastrophic fallout was an ever-present reality that hung over every meeting. I found my own role to be increasingly vital, serving as both a witness to his methodical dismantling of the Ashburton influence and a buffer against the mounting pressure from those who wished to see the inquiry buried in silence. As the final, decisive confrontation neared, the atmosphere in London became charged with a palpable electric tensions. Holmes had orchestrated the situation with the precision of a chess master, forcing the principal architects of the fraud into a corner where they would have no recourse but to reveal their hand. It all culminated in a quiet, unassuming meeting at a secluded private club in Pall Mall, a venue typically reserved for the most discreet and influential members of the political establishment. The room was heavy with the scent of fine tobacco and old leather. As various stakeholders gathered, the gravity of the situation was undeniable. Holmes stood at the head of the room, his presence utterly commanding, his demeanor one of calm, detached authority. He did not lead with accusations or histrionics. Instead, he began with a meticulously structured presentation of the financial evidence he had spent the last fortnight assembling, detailing the exact movement of funds, the falsified documentation, and the strategic deployment of political influence that had protected the operation from scrutiny. It was a masterclass in forensic accounting and logical deduction, a sequence of facts so damning and so elegantly presented that the opposition had no room to maneuver. I watched as the faces of the conspirators hardened, their initial bravado eroding under the relentless, step-by-step destruction of their carefully maintained covers. They attempted to deflect, to threaten, and finally to bribe, but Holmes met every effort with a dismissive, sharp-witted precision that served only to highlight the transparency of their desperation. He explained that the evidence was not merely in his possession, but had already been transcribed into a formal brief currently awaiting the attention of the Prime Minister and the Admiralty Board. The game, as he put it, was effectively concluded before the first drink had even been poured. One by one, the conspirators withdrew, their silence brought not by our discretion, but by the overwhelming certainty of their own imminent public downfall. When the last of them had departed, leaving the room in a heavy, echoing silence, Holmes permitted himself a single, brief sigh of release. He turned to me, his eyes bright with the familiar, satisfied light of a concluded mission, and remarked that there is a profound, singular beauty in the absolute, uncompromising nature of the truth. He had successfully prevented a diplomatic crisis of incalculable proportions, ensuring that the integrity of the state remained, for the moment, fundamentally intact. Our return to Baker Street was a somber, reflective conclusion to a case that had taken us into the very beating, corrupted heart of the empire. The city outside seemed to have returned to its normal chaotic pulse, unaware of how close it had come to a structural tremor that would have altered its entire trajectory. As we climbed the stairs, the familiar warmth of our lodgings greeted us like an old friend. Mrs. Hudson had left a late supper, the simple, honest aroma of it grounding us in the reality of our shared, predictable life. Holmes took his seat by the fire, his violin resting across his lap, though he made no move to play. He spoke of the Ashburton affair as he had of the Oakhaven mystery, not as a triumph of individual brilliance, but as a necessary, quiet intervention in the ongoing, imperfect work of civilization. He noted that the most significant problems are rarely the ones that require dramatic resolution. They are the ones that demand the patient, unwavering commitment to the details. He looked into the fire, the shadows dancing across his sharp, contemplative face, and I realized that this, above all else, was the true essence of his existence, the restless, unceasing drive to bring order to the chaos, regardless of the cost to his own comfort or the apathy of the world he served. The final embers in the grate finally collapsed into a fine, grey ash as the night reached its deepest, quietest hour. The case of the Ashburton manifests was formally filed, the documentation archived, and the potential scandal relegated to the ephemeral history of the daily journals. I looked at my friend, the consulting detective who had become the silent, watchful axis upon which our world turned, and felt a profound, enduring gratitude for the life we had shared. In all its complexity and danger, we had moved from the desolate, forgotten moors to the opulent, corrupted halls of power. Through it all, the singular, unwavering focus of his mind had been our guide. As I moved to extinguish the final lamp, Holmes looked up, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips, as if he were already anticipating the next inevitable knock at our door. The ledger of the city was vast, the opportunities for investigation infinite, and the truth, as always, was waiting just beneath the surface of the mundanes. Good night to our listeners of Baker Street Enigma. The cycle continues, the city breathes, and in the heart of London, the truth will always have its champion, waiting for the shadows to move and the questions to be asked. Stay diligent, keep your focus sharp, and always remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction.